Hey everybody, welcome to the first lecture on the female reproductive system. Probably going to do two videos on this, so let's get going. Big functions of the female repro system include the production of gametes. Remember, gametes are haploid sex cells, which in the case for the female are known as ova. Female repro system is also, of course, producing female sex hormones, primarily estrogens and progesterone. And naturally, the female repro system is going to house and take care of and eventually give birth to the embryo fetus baby combination. Okay, organs we're going to discuss include the uterus, the uterine tube or fallopian tube or oviduct, the ovary, the vagina, as well as the external genitalia. And we'll meet all of these organs, all of these structures as we go through this. So, ovarian function is going to primarily involve the production of oocytes, and interestingly enough, as we're going to talk about, oocytes, much of their production happens before birth even takes place. Ovarian function also involves ovulation. Ovulation is the release of a single oocyte per ovarian cycle or menstrual cycle. And when I say a single oocyte, I don't mean like per ovary, because of course the ovaries are paired. I mean per, human. Like every cycle, one oocyte is ovulated away. And we'll talk about what that means. And generally the ovaries alternate, like left, right, with each cycle. The ovaries are also the producers of those hormones, the estrogens as well as progesterone. If we look at where the ovaries are, they're these paired organs sitting in the abdominal pelvic cavity. They are attached to the uterus by a fibrous ovarian ligament. They are also draped with a mesentery called the broad ligament, and a portion of that mesentery extends laterally, and that is known as the suspensory ligament. So we see the broad ligament here folding over the uterus, the fallopian tube, and the ovary. If we slice the ovary open, we do see the portion of the broad ligament stretching to it, and this is called the mesovarium. We also see a couple structures of the ovary. We see the outer connective tissue layer, which is called the tunica albuginea, and we note that the ovary has a cortex as well as a medulla. The blood supply for the ovary primarily comes from the ovarian artery. Each ovarian artery is a branch off the abdominal aorta. So here's the surface of the ovary, and there is this layer of simple cuboidal epithelium known as the germinal epithelium on the very surface here. Then deep to that is this layer of fibrous connective tissue called the tunica albuginea, which means white coat, and we saw a similar connective tissue structure on the male gonad, which of course is the testy. So here in red, we see the ovarian cortex, and that is where we're going to find all of these interesting spherical structures, which are called ovarian follicles. Deep, we're going to find the ovarian medulla, and to be honest, we're not really going to discuss the medulla of the ovary. So, in the ovarian cortex, we find ovarian follicles. Ovarian follicles consist of a developing oocyte, so like a developing gamete, developing sex cell, surrounded by one or more layers of supporting cells. And there are actually four different basic types of ovarian follicles. There's primordials, primaries, secondaries, and graphians. And these are two primordial follicles here. These are the typical beginning follicles. So a female at birth has her lifetime supply of follicles, and all of the follicles she has at birth are going to be primordial follicles. Between birth and puberty, most of those primordial follicles are going to die, and then during every menstrual cycle, some primordial follicles begin their journey to become primary, secondary, and Graafian. And of course, as they go along this journey, most of them die along the way. So these are primordial follicles. We have a primary oocyte. So like here is the nucleus of the primary oocyte right here. Then this is the cytoplasm of the primary oocyte. Okay? And then around it, notice we have this single layer of simple squamous supporting cells. And when I see that, I know it is a primordial follicle. I got another primordial follicle over here. Here's the nucleus of the oocyte. Here's the cytoplasm of the oocyte. And then I'm seeing a simple squamous supporting cell right there. Okay, these are primary follicles. I still have the nucleus of the oocyte. Here's the cytoplasm of the oocyte. Same deal over here. And now I've got larger, more visible supporting cells, which can end up being in multiple rows. So these are two primary follicles. This one's a little more developed on the right-hand side here. Most primary follicles will die, but some will go on to become secondary follicles, which have a developing space in here. The space is known as the antrum. And when we see a small developing antrum, we know that we have a secondary follicle. And the secondary follicles, most of them are going to die. Okay, most secondary follicles are going to die. Typically, only one secondary follicle ends up becoming our next stage, which is the Graafian follicle. And by the way, the word antrum literally means cave. So, like the word cave. I don't know why I felt like I had to spell that for you, as if you wouldn't know how to spell it. And so cave, gives rise to like cavity, space, hollow part, cavern. There's the idea. Okay. So, secondary follicles, most die, but one will become a Graafian follicle. We usually end up with one Graafian follicle per menstrual cycle, and it actually takes multiple cycles for a primordial follicle to become a Graafian follicle. And the Graafian follicle has an oocyte. We just don't see its nucleus in this pic. And the oocyte is dwarfed by the size of the antrum. I mean, look how big the antrum is. And we see all the many multiple supporting cells as well. Now, bear in mind, we just named all four of these follicle types, and it takes multiple, maybe like 10 menstrual cycles for a primordial to grow all the way to a Graafian. And the Graafian follicle is the one that undergoes ovulation. This guy is going to rupture and burst, and the oocyte is going to be cast out of the ovary, only to be swept up by the fallopian tube. Speaking of fallopian tubes, there's Gabriella Fallopio. He's the namesake. They're often called uterine tubes. The fallopian tube is open and adjacent to the ovary, but not physically connected to it. Here we see a Graafian follicle undergoing ovulation, and this ovulated oocyte is going to get swept into the fallopian tube, where maybe, just maybe, it might meet a sperm cell. So the fallopian tube runs from the ovary to the uterus, but is not physically part of the ovary. The portion of the broad ligament supporting the fallopian tube is called the mesosalpinx. The word salpinx means trumpet because somebody thought it had like a trumpet sort of look to it. And as we said, the ovulated oocyte is received by the fallopian tube. Okay, the regions. There are 4 basic regions to the fallopian tube. These finger-like extensions here, and I see a bunch of them here, are called fimbriae. The word fimbriae literally means fringe. And you can see why they chose that word. So those are fimbriae. The fimbriae coalesce to form the infundibulum. Then the infundibulum gets kind of wide and curvy, and that is called the ampulla. The ampulla is where fertilization typically happens. In other words, where the oocyte meets the sperm cell. And of course, remember, an ampulla is a short, wide tube. Then finally, we have this region right here, which is the isthmus. Remember from geography class that an isthmus is a narrow piece of land with two bodies of water on each side. And so the narrowness of the tube is where it gets its name. So these are the different regions of the uterine tube. And this is the lining of the uterine tube. What do you see here? You see lots of cilia. And I know you were paying close attention to earlier, and you must have caught it when I said that when the oocyte is ovulated, it gets swept into the fallopian tube. And the sweeping action is because of the cilia. The whole uterine tube is lined by a ciliated epithelium, which helps sweep the oocyte as well as the developing embryo towards the uterus. All right, speaking of the uterus, it is our next organ here. And the uterus, of course, is going to receive that developing embryo, retain it, allow it to grow and develop, nourish it, and eventually use its smooth muscle to push it out. Note that the uterus is just anterior to the rectum, sort of behind it on top of the urinary bladder. The uterus does have three main regions. It has a dome part right here, which is very anterior facing, and then a big major portion called the body. And by the way, of course, the dome-shaped part is the fundus. I forgot to say that. Then the big major portion is the body. Then the neck, which is protruding into the vagina, is the cervix. Now, typically the normal uterus is anteverted, which means it leans forward. The vagina goes up, and then the uterus almost hangs a 90-degree turn, leans forward on the urinary bladder. But it can start to get retroverted, especially in old age and with multiple pregnancies. And that can increase the likelihood of the uterus dropping or prolapsing. We'll talk more about that in a second. Within the body of the uterus, we do find the uterine cavity, which is where we're going to find that developing fetus. Within the cervix portion, we have a narrow cervical canal, which is usually filled with mucus. That cervical canal is connected to the uterine cavity by an opening called the internal os. The word os simply means mouth. And we have a connection between the cervical canal and the vaginal canal called the external os. Here we see the cervical canal. Notice how narrow it is in this microscopic view. And we do notice a lot of mucus glands as well. Okay, as far as ligament support, the uterus is supported by the broad ligament, which we see here. The uterus is also supported by the round ligament anteriorly, as well as some other ligaments on the bottom of the pelvis. And the floor of the pelvis there are other ligaments. There's also muscular support. Remember, the floor of the pelvis has the pelvic diaphragm, and then the portion of that associated with the urethra and the vagina is the urogenital diaphragm. So this muscular diaphragm is supporting the uterus among other organs, urinary and digestive organs as well. This is what can happen if the ligamentous and the muscular support fails, and is more likely to happen if that uterus has become retroverted. This is a prolapsed uterus where the cervix is protruding from the vaginal orifice. All right, the uterus has three layers to its wall. It has an outer parametrium, a middle myometrium, and the lining is called the endometrium. The endometrium has two sublayers. And let me go back for a second. Of course, the myometrium is myo. That means muscle. It's made out of smooth muscle, which is going to provide the contractile force that pushes the baby out. Now, the endometrium has two sublayers. It has a superficial sublayer called the stratum functionalis. This is the layer that is going to grow in response to increasing levels of estrogen and progesterone. It's also the layer that is shed during menstruation. Deep to it is a thinner layer called the stratum basalis, and this layer does not respond to those ovarian hormones in the same way, and its job is to rebuild a new stratum functionalis after menstruation has taken place. So those are the two basic layers of the endometrium. And we see some histology here. Here's the smooth muscle myometrium. Here is the endometrium with the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. Notice that the stratum functionalis is going to have a simple columnar epithelium here. Notice we have multiple uterine glands that are primarily making a nutrient-rich mucus. Notice the abundance of purpleness in the stratum basalis as well. Think back to our discussion of the immune system and figure out what that purpleness means. Okay, as we continue our anatomical tour here, next organ is the vagina. The word vagina literally means sheath, and the vagina extends from the cervix to the vestibule, which is the space within the labia minora, which are the smaller skin folds. The vagina, of course, receives the penis during intercourse. It is going to provide that exit route for menses, which is the shed endometrial lining, and, of course, exit route for babies. Now, the epithelium of the vagina does sometimes extend out and cover partially or totally the vaginal opening, and that covering is called the hymen. Another anatomical tidbit we got to know is that because the cervix protrudes into the vagina, we have spaces on all sides, and those spaces are called fornices. Singular is fornix, so I have a posterior and anterior fornix here. These are two fornices. Here we see the epithelium of the vagina. Notice it is a stratified squamous epithelium, which is important for protection. That is always the function of stratified squamous epithelium. Also notice that the epithelium of the vagina does not contain any glands. It is a glandless epithelium. And as such, it's going to rely on the cervix as well as some external glands called the greater vestibular glands in order to have any sort of lubrication. Okay, let's keep going. Let's talk about the external genitalia. The external genitalia is collectively known as the vulva and includes this fatty region where the pubic hair is anterior to the pubic bone. That's called the mons pubis. Two fatty folds extending posteriorly from it are the labia majora. They are going to enclose smaller skin folds called the labia minora. The space within the labia minora is called the vestibule. And within that vestibule, we are going to find the external urethral orifice, the external vaginal orifice, as well as the clitoris. Looking at another picture here, we can see the clitoris, and notice how it is not just the protruding part, it extends backward, and then has these two legs extending back quite far as well. And like I mentioned a moment ago, we do see the urethral orifice and the vaginal orifice here. We also see the greater vestibular glands. These are mucus-making glands because remember the vagina does not make mucus on its own, so it relies upon the greater vestibular glands. as well as the cervical mucus glands for any sort of lubrication. Okay, we're almost done our run through of anatomy. Let's actually switch gears slightly in terms of where we're talking about. And let's discuss the mammary glands, which are modified sweat glands in the pectoral region that, of course, are involved in milk production. The mammary glands consist of 15 to 25 lobes, and I see some different lobes here. The lobes are within adipose tissue as well as connective tissue. The connective tissue is called the suspensory ligament of the breast. Now, the lobes of the mammary glands contain alveoli, which are the roundest structures here. Of course, we remember alveoli from other organs such as the lungs. The alveoli are where we are making the milk. The milk travels through lactiferous ducts. The lactiferous ducts terminate at and around the nipple, and along the way, the lactiferous ducts have these widened regions for milk storage, and those are called the lactiferous sinuses. And on that note, we are done with our anatomy, so I'm actually going to call it quits. We're going to do one anatomy lecture and then one physiology lecture for the female reproductive system. So we'll pick up next time. We'll talk about oogenesis, and then we'll talk about the various hormonal cycles and all the many changes that occur. See you next time. Bye.